Imagine this. You wake up one morning, the sunlight filtering through your window in delicate beams, the familiar sound of birds outside stirring in the cool morning air. You stretch, take in a deep breath, and as you open your eyes, you sense something strange, almost imperceptible, shifting in the air around you. For a moment, everything feels wrong. A shadow moves across the room, not a literal shadow, but an intangible presence, like a thought you've had once before, but forgotten, now pushing its way to the surface. You push the feeling aside, shaking it off as grogginess. Life resumes its rhythm. But deep inside, there's a quiet whisper, a seed of doubt, one that grows into a question that gnaws at the back of your mind. You can't place it at first, but it's there, lurking in the depths of your consciousness. What if death isn't what we think it is? The world around you continues, full of the usual noise, the hum of traffic, the hurried footsteps of strangers, the buzz of your phone demanding attention. But that question persists. What if death isn't the end? What if it's only the beginning? You shake your head. That's absurd. Death is final. The end of it all. The curtain falling, the silence that follows. The universal truth that everyone must face. But what if that's a lie we've been told? What if, instead of a termination, death is simply a threshold, a crossing point, a doorway to something entirely beyond our comprehension? You push these thoughts aside again, determined to focus on the reality in front of you. But it lingers, like a shadow on the edge of your vision. You can't ignore it. What if everything you've been taught about death, about life, is completely wrong? The question lingers, clinging to your thoughts, unsettling you in ways you can't yet articulate. And as it grows, it brings along something more. A feeling, a cold wave of recognition, an awareness that what you thought you knew about the world is built on a foundation of fragile assumptions. Because if death is not the end, then what does that mean for your life? What does it mean to be alive, to be human, if the very thing you fear the most might be nothing but a passage to something more, something we can't see, touch, or even imagine? This question is no longer abstract. It has pierced the surface of your daily life, leaving behind ripples, pushing you toward an unsettling realization. The world you see now, everything that feels so tangible, so real, suddenly seems fragile. Is this all there is? Is this the full extent of existence, or is there something just beyond the veil of what we can perceive? You might try to dismiss it. You might try to cling to the familiar certainty that death is an absolute end, that the finality of it is something we can't escape. But deep inside, something is shifting, and you can feel it. What if everything you've known is a carefully constructed illusion? And death, the thing you fear most, is only a gateway, just the beginning of something entirely different? So you wonder, if death is only the beginning, what does that say about the way we live? What does that say about the choices we make every single day, the relationships we forge, the things we give our time and energy to? What if we've been missing the point all along? And just like that, the tension builds, like a question hanging in the air, one that demands an answer, but one that you may not be ready to face. What if everything you think you know about life and death is wrong? Where do you go from here? This is where we must begin. Not with answers, but with that uncomfortable tension, the deep sense that something is terribly wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. That whispering thought that continues to nag at the back of your mind, questioning everything you thought you knew. As you linger in that place, uncertain, the only thing left to do is keep questioning. Because only in the unrelenting pursuit of truth, no matter how unsettling, can we hope to understand the true nature of life, death, and what lies in between. But perhaps, the answers we seek aren't what we think they are. When you take a step back and examine the fear surrounding death, it becomes apparent that what we truly fear isn't the end itself, it's the unknown. Death, as we've been taught to view it, represents a great chasm of uncertainty. It's the dark void into which we are supposed to tumble once our breath leaves us, and the final destination for everything we are, our identity, our experiences, our relationships. We, the living, have been conditioned to see death as an end, a severing, a cessation. But beneath this surface, there is something far more intricate, far more insidious, lurking in the shadows. What if that conditioning, the very foundation of our fear of death, is the root of a deeper, more troubling issue? Psychologically, we tend to view ourselves as discrete, finite beings. We are given a sense of self, a concrete idea of who we are, and we attach our identity to this self. This is what makes us human, our capacity for self-reflection, for meaning-making. But this very capacity creates a paradox. In defining ourselves, we are simultaneously defining our limits. We draw boundaries around our existence, constructing the narrative of, I am, to make sense of a world that often feels overwhelming. But these limits are fragile. They are constructed. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most penetrating minds in philosophy, once posited that we, as humans, live within a cage of our own making, surrounded by walls of meaning that serve to contain the chaos of existence. In Nietzsche's view, life and death are two sides of the same coin. Death is not an end to existence, but rather, an extension of it, one that frees us from the self-imposed boundaries we cling to so desperately. Nietzsche's famous declaration of eternal recurrence invites us to imagine that we are not finite creatures at all, but cyclical ones, eternally repeating our lives. But if we can't even comprehend this truth, if we can't even entertain the possibility that life and death are part of an infinite loop, how do we ever break free of the chains that bind us? How do we begin to see death not as an end but as an extension of the process of becoming? Jean-Paul Sartre, a man of existential thought, would argue that death doesn't end life, it robs us of our ability to construct meaning. Our very definition of the self is built on the premise of mortality. Sartre's existentialism is rooted in the idea that we are condemned to be free, free to choose, free to create our own purpose. And in this freedom lies the absurdity of existence. We know, deep down, that we will die, yet we continue to act as though the knowledge of death is something that can be avoided. We build careers, relationships, identities, and structures of meaning, all while knowing, consciously or unconsciously, that these things will be wiped away when death arrives. But Sartre argues that rather than retreating into a shell of denial or living in constant fear of death's finality, we must embrace this knowledge. Only by accepting the absurdity of our existence can we begin to transcend our fears and create authentic meaning. He believed that death was the ultimate existential question, the final test for our authenticity. Yet, why does our culture perpetuate this idea of death as a finality? Why, in the face of death's inevitable presence, do we cling so tightly to the notion that it is the end of everything? Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, though deeply pessimistic, touches on this same issue. For Schopenhauer, the core of human suffering stems from our unrelenting will to live, to cling to existence. We find meaning in the pursuit of life, in love, in achievement, in purpose. But as Schopenhauer would argue, life is ultimately a cycle of desire and suffering, an endless striving that can never be fully satisfied. Death, for him, is the great release, a liberation from the endless striving of existence. However, Schopenhauer's view was not one of finality. He believed that the will to live itself is what drives the cycle of suffering, and only through transcending this will could one find peace. We are not born with an innate understanding of death's true nature, we are taught to fear it, conditioned by societal norms that dictate what is acceptable to say, think, and believe about it. This conditioning takes root early, reinforced by cultural myths, religious doctrines, and the whispers of generations who, too, fear the unknown. Death becomes a taboo subject, something to be avoided in conversation, something to be feared in every moment of life. We are told that life is precious, but often, this preciousness is framed in terms of scarcity. There is only so much of it, and therefore we must make the most of it. But in this rush to make the most of our finite lives, we miss something essential, the opportunity to truly live, to embrace the mystery of existence in all its forms. We become obsessed with accumulating achievements, things, and accolades to fill the space between birth and death, terrified of the moment when it all comes to an end. And so, we create lives of artificial value, measured by standards that may have little to do with what we truly value. But here lies the crux of the problem. Our fear of death is not simply a fear of the end, it is a fear of the unknown. It is a fear of losing our identities, losing the structures that we have built around our lives. We are terrified of stepping beyond what we know, beyond the limits of our perceptions, into something that we can neither control nor fully comprehend. Perhaps, then, the true source of our discomfort with death isn't death itself, but our inability to accept that we are not in control of everything. The fragility of our identities, the structures we rely on, are all rooted in our perception of control. We cling to the idea that death is a final blow because to accept otherwise would be to relinquish control over the very essence of our existence. What if the truth is far more expansive than we can imagine? What if, in releasing the need for control, in letting go of the rigid structures we've built around life and death, we unlock something far more profound? It's a frightening proposition. But it's also one that invites you to look beyond the surface and ask, what if the limits we believe exist are merely illusions? What if the boundaries of death are just another veil, waiting to be lifted? What if, in facing the unknown, we could finally begin to understand the true nature of existence itself? But to understand that, we must first let go of everything we've been taught to believe about death, and maybe, just maybe, everything we've been taught to believe about life as well. Now that the illusion has begun to crack, we must delve deeper into the consequences of the cultural and psychological conditioning that shapes our view of death. These consequences, while largely invisible, are shaping every aspect of our lives, often without us realizing it. They silently influence our behavior, our relationships, and the very fabric of the societies we inhabit. The fear of death, the belief in its finality, creates ripples that extend far beyond the moment of our own passing. Consider this: how many of your decisions, both large and small, are driven by an underlying fear of death? You choose your career not just because it's fulfilling, but because it gives you a sense of stability, of permanence, of something that will outlast you. You invest in relationships not only because you love others, but because you fear the loneliness of an inevitable end. You seek wealth, recognition, and security not simply as an end in itself, but as a buffer against the impermanence that death represents. Everything you do is subtly, and sometimes overtly, influenced by the existential weight of your own mortality. You've been told, in one form or another, that life is fleeting. And so, in this fleeting existence, you try to leave something behind. You try to create something that will persist beyond your final breath. Perhaps you'll be remembered through your work, your children, or your achievements. But in truth, these are mere attempts to transcend the one thing you cannot control, the end. Yet, what if this entire drive to preserve oneself is born from a misunderstanding of what it means to live and die? What if the very act of clinging to permanence, to the idea of leaving a lasting legacy, is itself a reflection of a deep-rooted fear that you haven't fully acknowledged? And what if, in this clinging, you are missing out on the true nature of existence? The consequences of fearing death are subtle but insidious. Take, for example, the way our societies treat grief and mourning. We're told that the death of a loved one is something to get over, something to heal from, a wound that must eventually be closed. The emotional intensity of loss is considered a passing phase, a part of the natural process of moving on. But what if, instead of pushing through the pain, we were to embrace it fully, to sit with it and acknowledge it as part of the larger tapestry of life? Grief, in its rawest form, is not just a reaction to the loss of a person, it is a confrontation with the impermanence of everything. It's a moment when we are forced to stare into the abyss and face the truth we often try to avoid, that nothing is permanent, not even love. In avoiding the depths of this grief, in treating it as something to be conquered, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to transcend the illusion of permanence. In avoiding death, we are, in essence, avoiding life. We exist in a constant state of tension, pretending that we are invulnerable, that our reality is permanent. This denial forces us to live half-heartedly, because we are never fully present. We are forever concerned with the future, with what might come after, or with what we can leave behind. We fear the unknown so deeply that we fail to engage with the life we have in the moment. In doing so, we miss the opportunity to live authentically, to experience existence for what it is in its fleeting beauty. But this goes beyond just individual lives. On a societal scale, the fear of death shapes everything from the way we structure our economies to the way we value human life. Our obsession with wealth and success, our endless striving for security and safety, all stem from a deep fear of death's inevitability. We accumulate resources not just to fulfill our needs, but to cushion the impact of the unknown. We live in cultures that praise material success and achievement, pushing us to create legacies, to prove that we matter before we vanish. This societal drive to leave a mark manifests in more subtle ways as well. In the rush to accumulate wealth or attain status, we dehumanize ourselves and others. The pressures of capitalism encourage us to see people not as beings with intrinsic value, but as means to an end, as assets to be used in the pursuit of success. In the process, we lose sight of the true purpose of life, not to create something that will outlast us, but to experience it fully, without the constraints of fear. We become trapped in a never-ending cycle of striving, never pausing long enough to question what it's all for. Psychologically, we're trained to see death as a failure of sorts, a defeat, a tragedy. But this viewpoint distorts our understanding of the process of living itself. The problem isn't death, it's how we've been conditioned to view it. We allow this fear to guide our every step, but we never truly confront it. We run from it, hoping it will never catch us, but it always does. And in that running, we fail to live with the awareness that every moment is precious, that every breath is a gift, even as it's fleeting. Our fear of death causes us to put off truly living. We postpone our dreams, delay our desires, and hold back from being fully ourselves, always worried about the what-ifs. What if we fail? What if we're judged? What if we don't leave a legacy that will survive our death? This obsession with the future makes us prisoners of the present moment. We constantly live in a state of anxiety, unable to engage with the beauty of life because we are too busy preparing for its inevitable end. This fear doesn't just shape individuals, but also our collective behavior. It leads to societal systems built on survival rather than flourishing. It forces us into structures that prioritize safety and preservation over true growth and exploration. What if, instead of building walls around death, we were to dismantle those walls and see it as a natural part of existence, a transformation, a cycle, not an ending? In the silent background of our lives, the consequences of fearing death infiltrate every decision we make, every belief we hold. We live as though the sole purpose of existence is to stave off the inevitable, when in reality, the real purpose is to embrace the fullness of life, death included, and live with an awareness that transcends fear. To be fully human is not to pretend death doesn't exist, but to acknowledge it as part of the greater mystery, the great unfolding of existence that includes us all. As long as we remain trapped in the illusion that death is an end, we will never truly live. The greatest consequence of fearing death is that we waste life. Now, after acknowledging the psychological traps and societal forces that keep us tethered to a fearful view of death, a question lingers: how do we break free? How do we transcend the notion that death is the ultimate end, the final point in a life marked by the constant striving to outrun it? The answer doesn't lie in the familiar answers we've been given by mainstream culture, religion, or philosophy. The solution is radical, something that completely flips the script on everything we've been taught. To rebel against the fear of death, we must first let go of the illusion that life is a race against time. We must stop treating life as a countdown to a finish line, as a series of accomplishments meant to prove our worth. This mindset, ingrained in us since birth, keeps us running, always reaching for something that promises fulfillment, but never arriving at the destination. The rebellion begins when we accept that life isn't something to be accomplished, it is something to be lived, fully, in all its complexity, including its impermanence. At its core, this rebellion is about changing our perspective, not just about death, but about life itself. If death is not the end, then perhaps the essence of living isn't about survival. It's about experience. It's about embracing the ebb and flow of life, the transience of all things, and realizing that what matters isn't what we leave behind, but how we engage with what is in front of us, in this very moment. Consider Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, whose experience in the concentration camps led him to profound insights about the human condition. Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning, introduces an idea that radically challenges the way we view both life and death. Frankl's central thesis is that we can find meaning in life not through external accomplishments or the avoidance of suffering, but through the way we respond to suffering itself. He argues that while we cannot control the circumstances of our lives, we always have the freedom to choose how we meet those circumstances. This perspective shatters the myth that meaning must be sought in the external world, in wealth, fame, or legacy. Instead, Frankl offers a deep, counterintuitive truth: meaning is not something we find, it is something we create. The freedom to create meaning, even in the face of death, is what sets us free. In the same vein, we must shift our understanding of death itself. Instead of seeing it as the ultimate loss, the thing that robs us of our sense of self, the end of the narrative we've worked so hard to construct, death can be viewed as a teacher, a companion that calls us to live fully. It doesn't diminish the value of our existence, rather, it heightens it. Death's presence makes every moment more precious, more vibrant, more urgent. This is where the rebellion lies, in embracing death, not as a threat, but as a catalyst for living authentically. By recognizing that life is a fleeting, impermanent process, we begin to experience it more deeply. We stop taking it for granted. We stop hoarding time, rushing toward an uncertain future, and instead start living in the present, fully, without the constant need for validation or reassurance that we are accomplishing something before the clock runs out. The great figures of history who have truly transcended conventional views of life and death have done so by adopting this mindset. Take the example of the Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. The Stoic philosophers taught that we should focus only on what is within our control, the thoughts and actions we can shape, and relinquish our attachment to external outcomes, including the fear of death. For Stoics, death was not to be feared but accepted as part of the natural order. It was not the death of the body that mattered, but the integrity of the soul. By focusing on cultivating virtue and wisdom in life, they showed us that death is not the enemy, but rather the endpoint of a life well lived. Even in more modern examples, we see individuals who have embraced this radical shift in thinking. Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, famously confronted his own mortality with a clarity that informed his work and his life philosophy. When he was diagnosed with cancer, he was forced to reckon with the reality of death in a way most people never are. In his commencement address at Stanford University, Jobs said, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart." Jobs' words embody a core rebellion, the refusal to be governed by fear of death, the rejection of living inauthentically in the pursuit of material success or external validation. He embraced life with all its imperfections, its brevity, and its uncertainty. He didn't strive to escape death but used it as a reminder to live with purpose, passion, and authenticity. This is the breakthrough moment we all must reach, the understanding that death isn't an obstacle to avoid but a reality that gives life its meaning. It's a paradox that, once recognized, becomes liberating. By acknowledging death as inevitable, we are freed from the constant pursuit of preservation. We stop seeing life as something to be protected at all costs and start living it as something to be experienced fully, without hesitation. The rebellion is not against death itself, but against the fear and denial that cloud our judgment and restrict our potential. In this rebellion, we reclaim our autonomy. We take back control from the external forces that shape our perceptions of life and death. We stop running from the end and start embracing the fullness of the journey. The rebellion is one of radical presence. Of being here, in the moment, with all of its imperfections and uncertainties. The true freedom lies not in avoiding death, but in living with the knowledge that we are mortal, knowing that this awareness makes every moment we have all the more valuable. The path to freedom lies in embracing the paradox: death is not the enemy, but a catalyst for living. It is not the final word on existence, but an invitation to experience the profound depth of life. By accepting death's place in the cycle of life, we can stop living in fear, stop striving to outrun the inevitable, and instead focus on what truly matters, living authentically, deeply, and with purpose. And when we live this way, death ceases to be a shadow that looms over us. Instead, it becomes a reminder that the time to live is now, and the time to fear is never. Now, as we approach the final revelation, the culmination of the journey into this understanding, it is time for the ultimate truth to unfold. All that has come before, our fear of death, the unseen consequences of this fear, the rebellion to transcend it, has led us to this singular, radical realization. And it is here, in this moment, that everything you have feared, everything you have resisted, suddenly comes into focus. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, open landscape, an endless horizon stretching before you. You've walked this path, and you've come to the realization that the journey has not been about avoiding the inevitable but embracing it. You've let go of the illusion that life can be contained, controlled, preserved. And in that letting go, something profound has begun to happen. You start to see the world, not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of freedom. This is the ultimate truth: death is not the end. It is the doorway to a far more expansive and timeless understanding of existence. You have been told, conditioned, and molded into believing that life is a fragile, brief moment that must be protected at all costs, that the meaning of life is to accumulate, to achieve, to avoid the finality of death. But that belief is the greatest deception of all. What if I told you that death is not an event that interrupts life, but the very force that gives life its meaning and urgency? What if, in dying, you have always been part of something far bigger, something that cannot be contained by the individual self? What if the moment you are born, you are already beginning to die, and in that death, you are reborn over and over again in infinite cycles, constantly transforming and evolving? The truth is, the fear of death has kept you locked in a perpetual cycle of resistance. You've spent your life running, striving, trying to prove that you matter, trying to create something that lasts. But all the while, you've been missing the one thing that makes life truly significant: the acceptance of its impermanence. This truth was once understood by ancient cultures, by those who lived in harmony with nature and the rhythms of life. The Native American concept of eternal return teaches that life is a continual cycle: birth, death, and rebirth are all interconnected, inseparable. Every death leads to a new beginning. The Buddha, too, spoke of the cycle of samsara, the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth, not as something to be feared, but as an opportunity to transcend the attachments that keep us locked in suffering. For the Buddha, the key to liberation was not to deny death, but to see it for what it truly is: a natural part of existence, a teacher that frees us from the illusion of permanence. In a similar vein, the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, in his letters to a young poet, urges us to embrace the unknown, to live into the uncertainties of life, and to see death not as an end but as a profound transformation. Perhaps all the dragons of our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us once beautiful and brave, Rilke writes. The dragons, the fears, the limitations we face, are the very forces that shape us, that push us to grow. And the moment we accept death, not with dread, but with openness, is the moment we transcend our fear of it, and in doing so, transcend the limits of our own identity. Death, then, is not a finality but a revelation. It is a mirror that reflects back to us the truth of our existence. It shows us that the boundaries we place around ourselves, our identities, our possessions, our achievements, are nothing more than constructs, fragile and temporary. And in that reflection, we see the truth that all we have is this moment, this breath. The truth is that you are not your achievements, your reputation, or your fears. You are something far more profound, something eternal that cannot be touched by time or death. This realization shatters the myth of a self-contained, separate individual, bound by time and mortality. You are not alone in your journey. You are part of a vast, interconnected web of existence, one that transcends the individual and flows through all beings, all life, all consciousness. The moment you accept that you are not separate from this flow, you begin to dissolve the walls you've built around your identity, and in doing so, you dissolve your fear of death. In this radical shift in perception, you realize that death is simply a return to the source of all things, the essence that precedes and transcends individual existence. It is a return to the timeless, the infinite. You have always been part of this larger cosmic dance, and death is merely a transition, a passage from one form of existence to another. This truth is not just philosophical, it is deeply experiential. When you embrace the idea that death is not the end, but the continuation of a greater process, you begin to live differently. You no longer live in constant fear, constantly measuring your life against an invisible clock. You begin to experience the fullness of life, its beauty, its chaos, its contradictions, because you are no longer trapped in the illusion of time. You see each moment as sacred, as precious, not because it is fleeting, but because it is part of something eternal, something larger than you. What you once feared, you now understand. Death is not the enemy. It is the key that unlocks the door to a deeper, more expansive experience of existence. The greatest revelation is not that death is inevitable, it is that life, in all its impermanence, is the greatest gift we have. So, as you stand at the edge of this truth, I leave you with one final thought: you are already living the eternal, not in some distant future after death, but right now, in every breath you take, in every moment you allow yourself to fully be. The final realization is this: death is not something to fear, to resist, or to escape. It is simply the doorway that allows you to experience the fullness of life, its impermanence, its beauty, its mystery. The only question that remains is this: will you embrace the truth, or will you continue to live in the shadow of an illusion? The choice, as always, is yours. But in embracing this truth, you step into your most authentic life, unshackled by fear, and free to live fully, radically, and with profound meaning.